The 1967 war allowed Israel to occupy the Sinai, all of Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. It placed Egyptian forces on the west bank of the Suez, far from Israel, and pushed the Jordanians out of artillery range of the Israeli heartland. It pushed Syria out of artillery range as well. This created the strategic depth Israel required, yet it set the stage for the most serious military crisis in Israel's history, beginning with a failure in its central capacity, intelligence. The intelligence failure occurred in 1973, when Syria and Egypt managed to partially coordinate an assault on Israel without Israeli intelligence being able to interpret the intelligence it was receiving. Israel was saved above all by rapid rearmament by the United States, particularly in such staples of war as artillery shells. It was also aided by greater strategic depth. The Egyptian attack was stopped far from Israel proper in the western Sinai. The Syrians fought in the Golan Heights rather than the Galilee. Here is the heart of the 1967 border issue. Strategic depth meant that the Syrians and the Egyptians spent their main offensive force outside of Israel proper. This bought Israel space and time. It allowed Israel to move back to its main sequential strategy. After halting the two attacks, the Israelis proceeded to defeat the Syrians in the Golan, then the Egyptians in the Sinai. However, the ability to mount the two attacks, and particularly the Sinai attack, required massive American resupply of everything from aircraft to munitions. It is not clear that without this resupply the Israelis could have mounted the offensive in the Sinai or avoided an extended war of attrition on unfavorable terms. Of course, the intelligence failure opened the door to Israel's other vulnerability, its dependency on foreign powers for resupply. Indeed, perhaps Israel's greatest miscalculation was the amount of artillery shells it would need to fight the war. The amount required vastly outstripped expectations. Such a seemingly minor thing created a massive dependency on the United States, allowing the United States to shape the conclusion of the war to its own ends, so that Israel's military victory ultimately evolved into a political retreat in the Sinai. It is impossible to argue that Israel, fighting on its 1949 borders, was less successful than when it fought on its post-1967 borders. What happened was that in expanding the scope of the battlefield, opportunities for intelligence failures multiplied. The rate of consumption of supply increased, and dependence grew on foreign powers with different political interests. The war Israel fought from the 1949 borders was more efficiently waged than the one it fought from the post-1967 borders. The 1973 war allowed for a larger battlefield and greater room for error, but because of intelligence surprises and supply miscalculations, it also linked Israel's national survival to the willingness of foreign government to quickly resupply its military. When we look at conventional warfare, I would argue that the main issue Israel has is not its borders, but its dependence on outside powers for its national security. Any country that creates a national security policy based on the willingness of another country to come to its assistance has a fundamental flaw that will, at some point, be mortal. The precise borders should be those that A. can be defended, and B. do not create barriers to aid when that aid is most needed. In 1973, U.S. President Richard Nixon withheld resupply for some days, pressing Israel to the edge. U.S. interests were not those of Israel's. This is a mortal danger to Israel, a national security requirement that outstrips its ability to underwrite it. Israel's borders will not protect it against Iranian missiles, and rockets from Gaza are painful but do not threaten Israel's existence. In case the artillery rocket threat expands beyond this point, Israel must retain the ability to reoccupy and re-engage. If Israel is incapable of generating a national defense industry that can provide all the necessary munitions and equipment without having to depend on its allies, then it has no choice but to consider what its allies want. With the pre-1967 borders, there is a greater chance of maintaining critical alliances. The Stratford report goes on to say that Israel was actually more capable of defending their borders during wars based on pre-1967 lines than the wars fought after those loosely defined lines were established. Meaning, more land does not equate to better security for Israel. If that were the case, giving back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, Israel's most formidable opponent at the time, was a terrible idea. With this said, strategically, many experts do not consider the placement of borders as Israel's number one priority, but the continued reliance on outside sources such as the United States to supply and resupply them with much needed military munitions now and in the time of war. This has proven critical to Israel in their last two battles with both Hezbollah and Hamas. Military experts state that both wars ended not necessarily because of a ceasefire, but due to the United States cutting off of vital military parts and munitions. Israel simply ran out of ammunition and was at the mercy of the U.S. to keep their supply coming in. If Israel does ultimately agree to pull back to a compromising pre-1967 border, it will likely be due to U.S. pressure of cutting them off of much needed military aid and resupplyment. If this were to happen, it would only be a matter of time before their military machine would grind to a screeching halt. As far as the Islamic world is concerned, this option would play much more in their favor than Israel retreating back to pre-1967 borders. Frankly, I believe the time is coming when the U.S. administration will use military aid and resupplyment as a vital card to make Israel fall in line with international demands. Spain is the most recent nation to indicate that they will be recognizing a Palestinian state along 1967 borders come September. Over 150 nations have pledged to do the same. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu appears to be holding strong, but that may change in the coming months. Both the White House and Israeli officials have confirmed that there will be an early three-way summit between U.S. President Obama, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, and PA leader Abbas sometime this summer. This is Terry Malone with the Calvary Prophecy Report.